Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to bust a myth that 70% of change initiatives fail. All right, so how are we going to do that? Well, first we'll talk about the myth itself and really where the origin is. Where did this thing even come from? Then we'll get into the truth about the success and failure of change management initiatives. And then finally talk about what do we do now? And really, to a large extent, what do we do now is what this entire course is all about. How do we apply change analytics to a change initiative so we can know really what is going on? Let's jump in and talk about our pieces here. So first, the myth. So I want to review with you what's been written and how those writings have moved forward through time to generate this myth and really where it came from. And from there, we can then talk about how it propagated out. So if we look at this timeline, what seems to be the very origin of all of this, although as we'll see, misquoted, comes from the work that Michael Hammer did way back in the early 90s. So his work was really around this idea of re-engineering. So he was process-driven and wrote his first article that started to lay this out back in 1990. It was an HBR article, and then came out with two books, in 93 and in 95. So let's dive into those and we'll look at those and then see what happens from there to the work that goes with Beer and Noria in 2000 and what they wrote and how that built off of what had come previously from Hammer. So in his book, Re-Engineering the Corporation, Michael Hammer said this: "Sadly, we must report that despite the success stories described in previous chapters, many companies that begin re-engineering don't succeed. Our unscientific estimate is that as many as 50% to 70% of the organizations that undertake a re-engineering effort do not achieve the dramatic results they intended." This seems to be the origin passage for this idea of the 70% myth. So let's just take a look at what Hammer actually said. First, what he said was there's a range between 50% and 70%. Secondly, he said it was unscientific. So that means something. Right? This was not a research project. This is the intuition that he and James Champy had in the work that they did around re-engineering the corporation. They also talk about not achieving the dramatic results intended, so all of those results. And they were not talking about change, they were talking about process re-engineering. And certainly there's a relationship between the two, but they're not the same. Hammer started to hear about the misuse of this phraseology as it related to change. And just 2 years later, in his second book, The Re-Engineering Revolution, he said this: "In re-engineering the corporation, we estimated that between 50 and 70% of re-engineering efforts were not successful in achieving their desired breakthrough performance. Unfortunately, the simple descriptive observation has been widely misrepresented and transmogrified and distorted into a normative statement. There is no inherent success or failure rate for re-engineering." So Hammer in this book is saying that what people were already saying about his efforts were not true. And he used the term normative statement, and that's meaningful in mathematics in that it means that there's an underlying inside the actual process truth to something. And Hammer's explicitly saying that that is false. But we'll see now it didn't matter. Even with his own book, this is out of the barn, and this idea of the 70% myth is just going to start rolling forward. It first starts to show up in the work that Beer and Noria do just a few years later, in 2000, their book, Breaking the Code of Change. And what they start to talk about is this. Strikingly, in chapter 12, Pettigrew cites Bashian et al. In 1994, estimating, quote, that around 70% of BPR interventions, that's business process reengineering, do not meet expectations. But Bashan et al.'s 1994 finding is based upon Hammer and Champy's, whose author said that they were not indicating that 70% of change initiatives fail. So here we see already other researchers are trying to squash this myth that's starting to come out now, that 70% of initiatives fail. Still mostly talking about process initiatives, not broadly change initiatives, but those numbers are out there and they're starting to get repeated. In the second part of the timeline, we start with John Kotter's book, A Sense of Urgency, and then move forward from there into consultant white papers. And that's really where we just lose it in our ability to wrap our arms around this myth. It gets repeated again and again through multiple consulting firms and against multiple white papers. And it's not really until 2011 when Mark Hughes writes his paper that much of this presentation is based around, do 70% of change management efforts really fail? And he outlines this whole history of the myth growing and how it continued to evolve from there. And so I want to finish this timeline with the work that Behrens and others put together around the effects of change interventions and what kind of evidence do we really have to kind of wrap this up. But before we do that, let's go to Kotter, a luminary in change management, whose book, A Sense of Urgency, had a lot of importance and was widely read. And let's see what Kotter actually says. From years of study, I estimate today more than 70% of needed change either fails to be launched, even though some people clearly see the need, fails to be completed, even though some people exhaust themselves trying, or finishes over budget, late, and with initial aspirations unmet. Okay, so let's take this apart. What Kotter says is certainly 70%, but he calls that an estimate. Again, not a scientific study that's been done, but just his estimate based on what's going on. And then what he says about that estimate is three things: that change efforts fail to launch, fail to be completed, or they finish over budget, late, and with initial aspirations unmet. I don't see that as the same as a change management initiative failing. Right? Maybe some parts of the initiative aren't achieved, but that's not a complete failure. And then part of what Kotter is talking about is that they don't even get launched. So it's certainly not possible to include them as change management initiatives fail, especially if the implication is that you're not going to be able to get the value that you want. You haven't even started. So how do you call that part of a failure rate? Where we lose it is then as it starts to come into the consultant realm. And here is the first phrase that we really see this 70% starting to get hammered, and from here it keeps being repeated again and again. And this comes from Bain and Company. Quote, people have been writing about change management for decades, and still the statistics haven't improved. With each survey, 70% of change initiatives still fail, and the world is getting more complicated. So I love the fact that they are referring back to surveys. What I don't love is that they don't tell you what surveys. They don't provide the data for those surveys so someone else could independently look at what the information is and draw their own conclusion, which is what peer-reviewed research is supposed to be able to do. They put this out without citing anything, without reference, and without data. And it is from here, again and again, that these white papers coming from consultants are repeated about what I'm calling a myth, that 70% of change initiatives have failed. And hopefully you are seeing this as well, because the references that they are making are to people that are saying that's not at all what they meant, and that wasn't what they were talking about, and at best those were estimates anyway. The final straw is when it comes into McKinsey papers and start to take off from there. And as many of you may know, these McKinsey papers are often cited both in the popular news media as well as by other consultants. And here's what McKinsey said. McKinsey & Company recently surveyed 1,546 business executives from around the world, asking them if they consider their change programs completely, mostly successful. Only 30% agreed. So I've looked at that report, and that is the setup that they have. What comes out of that, though, is that the remaining part failed. That is not what that survey shows. That survey shows other increments of partial success down to partial failure, and only a very small percentage actually said that their change initiatives fail. But even in McKinsey's own follow-on white papers, they cite 70% failure rate and reference this white paper. That is not a correct way to go about interpreting the facts of their very own information. And again, they don't provide the data, they only provide the statistics. So what is the truth? Let's try and examine that. If it's not really a disaster, then where are we? Well, unfortunately, it's difficult to really know where we are. And in the work that Behrens and others have done within his paper that appeared in Applied Behavioral Science, he said this: despite its growing volume, OCM's body of evidence is of low quality and growing lower. This trend must be reversed. Drawing on the ecumenical attitude proposed by McGrath, 1981, and Edmondson and McManus, 2007, we urge OCM researchers to join forces to collectively create a convergent body of evidence that builds on previous studies. What does that mean? It means he's looking back at other studies, looking back at what other researchers have pulled together, and realizing that we don't have good evidence of success or failure. So we can't make a claim that 70% of change management efforts fail because we don't have the evidence to show that. Unfortunately, we also don't yet have the evidence to say what is the success rate or what drives success or what even those factors are. And so what we're advocating in this class that we put together is that all of us, all of you, start to apply metrics within your change initiatives so that you can then analyze them and make this movement from data to information to knowledge, which actually helps us to really understand what is going on with the change initiative. So what do we do now? What we need to do now is to do a better job at actually measuring what we're doing with our change initiatives and put an analytics program together to make that happen. And researchers show that as they talk about what are the drivers for those initiatives. So this is just a summary of some of the comments that are out there. One, there's a lot of ambiguity in organizational change. That's no revelation to all of you. You know that already. But it's important to start to see this exhibited in academic literature and that researchers are starting to look at it as well so that we can tackle what is causing that ambiguity or how do we get past that ambiguity. Two, organizational change is highly context dependent. And again, you know that as well. If the world is changing around you, there's going to be impacts on the change. It doesn't live inside its own bubble, and so that all the efforts that are put into it are able to be the only things that impact. It doesn't happen that way. Other things outside of it matter, and so that context matters. And so we need to bring that context in order to have an understanding of the success or failure of the change initiative. Three, perceptions of organizational change outcomes, meaning that not everybody agrees on what the actual outcome was. And again, would say if we were measuring that and agreeing to those measurements up front, then we would know whether or not we were getting the outcomes that we wanted and be able to talk specifically about the quantitative impact of those outcomes because we would have the metrics to be able to show that. Four, time in organizational change outcomes. So certainly this, again, all of you know that as an effort moves through time, other things are happening around it. So the longer it takes to put something together, the more likely it is that there is some sort of an impact on it. And so, again, matched with context, we need to bring all of that in to be able to tell the full story of what is going on with this initiative and then be able to judge, has it been a success or a failure, or where on the spectrum it's showing up. And finally, 5, measurability of organizational change outcomes. And this is exactly what we want to talk about in this course, is being able to put together metrics so that you know the change outcomes and to what level you are able to achieve those change outcomes. As you'll see, when we get into the course, we're going to advocate for a 3-layered approach that's going to look at self-reported metrics, observable metrics and behaviors, and finally what the existing metrics are, the metrics that the business or organization is already using. And what we're going to do is combine this whole body of metrics after carefully looking at which ones are useful and which ones are not so useful, and then use that to get actionable insights. And we'll be able to answer specific questions about what is going on with the change. And are the metrics letting us know whether or not the change is progressing as we intended or not, so that we can see, are we getting the behaviors we want or not, or is something else standing out, and then take action. Be able to put an intervention together that we've already planned to help ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we want out of our change initiative. That's what this course is going to be about, and walk us through the different ways in which to make that happen. So hopefully you've seen out of all of this that certainly the 70% failure rate is a myth, or at least has no basis in fact that we can look at. And that our good information, unfortunately, is also scarce. And so we're advocating, let's go get some good information. And so put better measurement practices in place so that we have those within all of the initiatives that we're doing, and then be able to use that measurement to give us insight to put an intervention in place to ensure that our change initiative is going to go well. So how are you going to get to change success? We're going to measure what's going on and then take action on it to be able to make something happen. We're looking forward to seeing you in the subsequent modules and lessons as we start to learn about all of that. See you there.